Hi, everyone, and welcome to the fifth iteration of the Agile Educate Summit. And this year we are going for a whole week. But before I go into details, I'd like to acknowledge the country on which we meet. Today I come from the land of the Kombermeri saltwater people of the Ugamba language region. And I invite you to think on whose land you are residing on at your location. Sovereignty was never ceded, and the lands have always been and always will be Aboriginal land. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and I extend my welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people joining us today. So, welcome. For those who don't know me, my name is Jens, and I'm Agea's Director of Industry Member Relations. And for those who don't know Agea, we're the peak industry association for the video game sector here in Australia. The focus of this year's Educate Summit is on human skills, i.e. what are the attitudes and mindsets the Australian games industry wants to see from junior talent. It's not just about your portfolio after all, and we will kick off the week with Gameloft's Matt Pierce talk on Agile Thinking and a fail-fast approach, i.e. the ability to rapidly prototype, iterate, design ideas, and objectively discuss what aspects of the process could be improved and which ones did not go to plan. Before I hand over to Matt, I would like to sincerely thank the city of Port Phillip for generously sponsoring and supporting this event and the Playside Studio Tour that concludes this week. Speaking of, for those of you who can't make it to the tour, we will record the presentations that are given there and make them available later to spread the love. You're likely familiar with the format of this webinar. In case you're not, Matt will do his presentation. And after that, you'll get an opportunity to ask some questions. And I would like you to do that via the Q&A function of Zoom. So you'll find that at the bottom, there is a Q&A button. Please use that as opposed to the chat. The advantage of the Q&A function is that we can more easily track your questions and we can mark them as answered. And well, that's pretty much it from me. So Matt, thank you so much for making yourself available, and over to you.
No problem. Thank you for the introduction. And look, I will actually say, if you do have a question section and you feel you want to sort of dive in with anything as I go through, I'm happy to take questions on the fly as we go as well, or questions at the end. Okay, so thanks for that introduction. I think that did a really good job actually of just sort of showing the context we're talking about in here. And so agile thinking and a fail fast approach is the topic that we have for the talk today. So for anyone who wasn't aware, we had a list of topics that were sort of effectively asked for people to talk on, and this was one given to us. So fundamentally here, agile thinking and a fail fast approach, what we're talking about is project management. And project management, absolutely, we're talking about this in the context of games, but project management as a theme is something that can apply in all sorts of realms. It can apply in a lot of businesses, whether they're IT related or whether it's building a house, and it can be things that are mega scale projects like the Olympics that are going to be on in Brisbane in a few years, all the way down to getting that job done around the house can also be a project. So they can happen at all different scales as well. Agile thinking and fail fast are actually both effectively, if you like, almost slang terms. They aren't firmly defined things. They're things that are used as industry terminology for approaches to certain problems. So although they do have fairly clear meaning as well, there is a question here of if you ask 10 different people to give you a definition of them, you might end up with 10 different answers. So where I thought I would start out is actually just talking about how I'm defining those terms for what I'm talking about today, so that the context is clear in what I'm discussing. Other people might have different definitions, so that's just something to be aware of whenever you approach a topic like this. So to start out with that, one thing I'll say that what I am not talking about is agile methodology, which is different than agile thinking. Agile methodology, often related to things like Scrum or Kanban or things like that. Those are project management methodologies. They are methods that you can apply to the way you manage a project, and often they get conflated with fail fast approach or agile thinking, but realistically they are actually entirely different things. In a sense, those methodologies are supposed to empower a fail fast or an agile thinking approach, but you can absolutely be taking a fail fast approach to things and not be using one of those agile methodologies, and you can actually or be applying agile thinking and not be using one of those methodologies. And by the same token, you can absolutely be using one of those methodologies and not truly using agile thinking or failing fast. So they are, if you like, orthogonal to an extent, even though they are both designed to be complementary. And one thing that Agile definitely isn't as well is a software package or a management package or something like that. So that's something I would say, if this is something you decide to go away after this and research to learn more about on your own, one thing I would say is be aware of hype and marketing, because if you search for a lot of these topics, what you will find is an awful lot of material from companies that are very good at search engine optimization. And usually they are going to be selling you either a software package or a training package or a book. Generally speaking, if they're selling you a training package or a book, at the very least, they are going to be trying to give you content around project management. But particularly in the case of a software company, being agile and taking an agile approach to project management is not about using a particular piece of software. So if you go searching for this kind of thing, you will find a lot of things written by software companies trying to tell you how buying their software package and using that is going to make your children beautiful and all of your dreams come true and all of those kinds of things. You can be agile and be using no software at all. You can be planning on paper. And one thing I will say about those agile methodologies as well is that with any methodology, a lot of what we talk about when we're talking about fail fast or agile thinking is really as I say, the concept behind some of those agile methodologies. Trying to apply any methodology without trying to understand the fundamental reasoning behind it is going to be prone to behavior. So if you can learn about a fail fast approach and about agile thinking, and you can understand what that entails, you'll be in a better position to try and apply, in my opinion, an agile methodology, because you can take that thinking and apply it to the situation. So to start with, what is agile thinking? So agile thinking is often described as being collaborative, being flexible, being creative, but also being rational and scientific. Realistically, what we're talking about when we're talking about agile thinking is taking an approach that works against the natural cognitive biases that all humans have when we approach project management in specifically. This is, and fail fast is really talking about iterative development, which is an approach that's taken to approach problems in a way that finds faults and problems earlier in the production cycle in order to minimize the cost of the inevitable failures and that happen in any project of any scale. These two are absolutely complementary things, because understanding risks in a project and managing those risks is something that humans are surprisingly bad at. And that plays into a lot of our cognitive biases play a large part of that. So how we manage our cognitive biases is important to taking a fail fast approach. Now, just one thing I should say as well is that fail fast, I think, can often be misconstrued as diving in headlong without a plan. And that is not, in my opinion, that's not the way that fail fast should be interpreted. In fact, it can actually be quite the contrary. It's really about taking an approach where you are planning before things get expensive. We often will talk about a project timeline. Now I need to think about the mirroring here. Timelines usually start on the left, which for those of you viewing in the camera should be on this side, and they move towards the right. And if you have an iterative cycle, usually projects, particularly if they're like team managed projects, will ramp up over time. Things get more expensive towards the end, and you've spent more time and money on something by you get to, towards the end. Fail fast is really about moving the failures and the solutions and the problem solving to the cheapest and earliest time possible in order to make your general production more efficient. One thing I'll say about the way I might talk about a lot of these topics today is that a lot of what I might say will sound obvious. And what that really is about is that if I say, well, okay, if you should find your problems early, and then if you find a problem, you should change what you're doing, you'd think to yourself, well, of course you'd do that. Why would any rational person do anything different? This really comes back to that idea of cognitive biases and the way we operate as humans. And I really like that then this is effectively being framed in terms of human skills, if you like, for these talks as well. It's important to acknowledge that as humans, as much as we might try to be perfectly functioning and perfectly rational beings, the reality is that we are not. There are things that we do as people that are the results of evolution and psychology. And the important thing to know is these things have been studied for many years, and it's actually quite well known what they are. And the way that humans operate and the way that these biases apply to projects are fairly consistent. And generally speaking, all projects, almost without fail, sorry, I shouldn't say all projects. The vast majority of projects in any scale, whether it be small scale to large scales, usually run over time and over budget. And this happens consistently everywhere. It's very rare for people to plan out a project and that project people to get to the end of that project and go, oh my God, that was way easier and way cheaper than we all expected. It's come in taking less time and less budget. If you've encountered that situation, I'm sure it came like a black duck situation. The vast majority of times projects run over time and over budget, and the reason that happens is because of the way we approach things as humans and our cognitive biases. So one thing going into any project planning and project managing that I think is important to acknowledge going through is it's like going to the casino. The deck is already stacked against. And you'll see this in a lot of the writings on this topic if you start looking into sort of any of the books or a lot of the research that's done on project management. Is the deck is stacked against you, and if you don't understand that going into a project and acknowledge that, then you're basically you're going in with your arms tied behind your back, because you need to acknowledge that that's going to be the case, that you're going to be overly optimistic. Now, actually, it's important to say here as well that when you look at the fact that most projects go over time and over budget, there are actually two main driving features behind that. There is, as I say, cognitive biases. There are other contexts and other reasons why projects go over time and over budget, and that is in context where strategic misrepresentation happens. Strategic misrepresentation is basically a term for when people misrepresent how well a project is going to go for effectively their own vested means. So somebody underquoting how long a job will take, and then through the process they go, oh, hang on, sorry, we've had all these things we didn't anticipate, and then adjusting the quoted price, if you like, during the process, and then having to revise things up. That might be strategic because they realize they're more likely to win a contract or win a tender by underquoting. Or if, say, a politician is taking a project to the populace, and they might they want everyone to think this is going to be great. They have strategic reasons potentially to downplay the risks and upsell the benefits of something. So realistically, those are the two reasons that projects generally run over time and over budget. And in this context, though, of course, we're really only talking about strategies and approaches to deal with the cognitive biases side and the way that we approach things. Okay, so basically, the patterns of a fail-fast approach to development are basically designed to work against those cognitive biases. Okay, so one thing I would say is to anyone, I'm a big fan of looking at cognitive biases and understanding how they work. I would actually even say, I might even just, if I can here, sorry, because I've got this minimize, I'm not actually sure how to just see if I can share my screen. There we go. Okay. This is the Wikipedia list of cognitive biases. I would highly recommend anyone who's going to go in, honestly, do any kind of project planning or project management to make a start simply by just familiarizing yourself with the list of cognitive biases that are even on Wikipedia. It's a really good place to start, just with understanding a lot of the way humans work and the tendencies that we all have, and understand that when you're approaching planning a project and how you can work against it. Excuse me, I'm just struggling to get tech here for a minute. There we go. Just going to go back to my notes. Okay, so when we talk about cognitive biases in regard to project planning, there are 4 that are usually quoted as being the main ones, and then there's a few others that I might mention as we talk about here. So optimism bias, overconfidence bias, availability bias, anchoring bias, loss aversion, also known as the sunk cost fallacy. Other biases also apply. So it's probably, so to start with, I might just sort of run through a few of these and just sort of explain what these tendencies are, so that we can then go on and talk about how taking a fail-fast approach can work against these biases for project planning. So optimism bias, I think, is fairly straightforward and is fairly obvious in terms of project planning. The general tendencies of all humans is to believe that they're less likely to experience a negative event than other people are. This is one of the fundamental ideas of optimism bias, and it's fairly demonstrable. So when it comes to project planning, cost, schedule, and benefits are really the 3 core things that need to be estimated for a project. And the general tendencies of humans will be to underestimate the cost, underestimate the schedule and how long it will take, and overestimate the benefits of a project. So it's important just to recognize that will happen. Anchoring bias is another important one to mention here. The anchoring effect is a psychological phenomenon in which an individual's judgment or decisions are influenced by a reference point or an anchor, which can be completely irrelevant to the to what should actually be considered when making that decision. So usually with anchoring bias, it's often the first piece of information that a person receives about a situation, and you often will get fixated or stuck on that. This includes, and so within anchoring biases, there are a few other biases that get mentioned. These include conservatism bias, which is the tendency of humans to basically insufficiently revise their beliefs once new evidence is presented. So you can sort of understand how, so as we talk about fail fast being an iterative approach, the reason that understanding anchoring bias and conservatism bias is important there, it's important to recognize that once you start down the path of a project and you have an iteration, generally speaking, human psychology doesn't want to move away from your impression that you had going in at the beginning. It's really important to recognize that your brain will not want to incorporate the new evidence and to change your approach once that's turned up. Functional fixedness is another one. Functional fixedness is basically where we have a tendency to only use objects in the way that those objects have been traditionally used. So this also applies. So if you take a hammer, hammers are for hitting nails, and that's what you think about it. But if you only ever see people hitting nails with a hammer and it's a claw hammer, you might not realize, hang on, I can use the back of that hammer for pulling out nails, because you haven't seen somebody else pulling out that nail. So it's basically, if you've got a usual way of doing something, it's not changing. So again, if you're trying to be agile, you're trying to work against that tendency. And that actually flows into what's also sometimes called the law of the hammer, which is that when all you have is a hammer, everything tends to look like a nail. So it's basically, you have a tendency to always think that the problems that you currently know how to solve are the ones that should be solved. Loss aversion is another important one to consider in project planning as well, also known as the sunk cost fallacy, which is that if you've already invested time or money into something, generally speaking, humans have a tendency to actually, if I read out the definition here, the perceived disutility of giving up an object is greater than the utility associated with acquiring it, which is a way of basically saying that if we have a tendency to overvalue the effort we've already put into acquiring something, and when giving it up might actually be the best option because we might be able to go and get something else. We have a tendency to stick with something where we've already invested our time and effort. One of the sort of classic, and I'm not sure how apocryphal it is, examples that's often given for this is what's known as the monkey trap, where a box is created with a hole in it small enough that a monkey can get their open hand through the hole, but they can't get a closed fist out of the hole. And then a small quantity of rice is placed inside the trap, with the idea being that the monkey will put their hand in through the hole, grab a fistful of rice, and they won't be able to remove it. Now, as the hunter comes back, they'll be able to then just find the monkey, and they've caught a monkey at that point, right? And you'd think, well, it should be really obvious that you should just drop the rice, because being caught by the hunter is far worse than that fistful of rice is worth. And the idea is that basically we have a tendency to not want to let go what we've already invested time and effort to get into getting, even when it would actually benefit us more to let go of that thing and move on to another approach. Okay, so that talks about what those cognitive biases are and what we need to work against. And agile thinking is the approach we want to take to work it. So agile thinking effectively is recognizing those biases and trying to work against them. And fail fast is the approach that's often taken to effectively encourage that way of thinking. But it's important to recognize that motivation when trying to apply a fail fast approach. So fail fast, what is it? It's an iterative development process. One thing I will say going in as well is I've encountered it a few times that sometimes people don't like the word fail and fail being used in the description of a fail fast approach, and they don't like the idea of the negative connotations around failing. They don't want to encourage failure within an organization. So when I've looked into this as well, sometimes people try and use as an alternative term for fail fast, learn fast. And now one thing I like about that term learn fast is it does actually encompass what the idea behind a fail fast approach is supposed to be about. It's not about trying to fail. It's about trying to learn, and to learn as quickly as possible. It's about acknowledging that you will not have made a perfect plan going into things, and you need to learn. You don't have all the pieces of information you need going in to begin with, that you need to get more information about what the approach will be. However, you will see some people use these terms interchangeably. However, I've also seen cases where people will talk about moving away from a fail fast approach towards a learn fast approach and describing them as being different things. So this is why I started out with terminology at the beginning. There are different ways that people can define these terms. Personally, I like the term fail fast. I like the idea of embracing failure because I think it's about acknowledging our humanness and acknowledging that people will always make mistakes, and making that, and recognizing that you need to be prepared for failures when they happen, and deal with them when they happen, rather than being in a situation where unexpected outcomes or bad turns of events can sink your project. You want to be in a situation where you can treat a failure as an opportunity, and be ready to learn from it, and then to embrace change that comes from that learning. I think where a fail fast approach is bad and can fail is when you don't learn from the mistakes. Learning from the mistakes is critical. And when I come back, so if I come back to what I was saying earlier about needing to understand these principles before trying to apply an agile methodology, to take Scrum as an example, if you try to apply an approach where you're working in sprints, if you're just going through an iterative approach, you're going through sprint after sprint after sprint, and you're not learning from mistakes that happened in earlier sprints and then changing your approach in later ones, then you might be applying an agile methodology, but you aren't applying agile thinking, and you aren't learning from those mistakes. So that's where I think understanding that dichotomy, if you like, between failure and learning is really important. And I think one of the best ways that gets described is what I've seen described in a few contexts as the law of holds, which is I won't bother looking up the Wikipedia page that has lots of nice quotes on it that's poorly cited, but basically there's sayings that go back a long time, which is, if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. This actually again comes back to another cognitive bias thing, which is escalation of commitment. We have a tendency to, and again, this relates to sunk cost fallacy. The more we invest in something, or if we say yes to something once, and then we give something a further yes and another yes, we have a tendency as humans to want to keep saying yes to that thing. Really, what you want to do in a fail fast, you always have to be assessing where you're at, learning from when things have gone wrong, and when things aren't going wrong, you have to stop digging. That's really important. So now it's also important to acknowledge that in almost any project, that is going to happen at some stage. Something is not going to go right. The idea of fail fast. So if we move away from the failing and learning part of that to the fast part, is in that project timeline, it's about moving those failures as early as possible in the project's life cycle, where it's as cheap as possible to fail. So again, this comes back to what I was saying about fail fast is not about diving headlong into a project without making a plan. What it really is about is making the best plan you can, but also recognizing where the risks exist in the plan and adjusting the order in which you approach things in order to find those failure points and as quickly as possible, and figure out if your strategies for addressing those risks is going to work or not. One thing I would say about this as well is that I've mentioned that this can apply to everything from really small projects to mega projects. One of the things that is a general rule of project planning is self-similarity. If you haven't heard of self-similarity before, it's the idea that there are systems that look the same whether you look at them on a small scale or a large scale. So coastlines is a classic example. If you look at the contour of a coastline of a town, or look at the contour of a coastline for a state or a country, the patterns tend to be similar. There's a self-similarity. Fractals are often self-similar, where you have a similarity of features at different levels. So projects are self-similar. You can have cycles not just at you can have self-similarity, and you can have iterative cycles going on, in the sense of, if you take a game studio, for example, you can have project by project by project, and you can be learning from the mistakes of your previous projects when you apply them to your next project. Or you can be looking at the milestones within a project, or you can be looking at sprints if you're working in a sort of agile methodology and sprint planning. You can sprints within that, but you can even be looking right down to, you know, what you do with task by task or day by day as well. There's a self-similarity in that iteration. You can be iterating at different scales. Or another way to think of that, so that would be a schedule way to break down that self-similarity. Another way to approach self-similarity would be design self-similarity. So you've got an entire game, perhaps, but you can also be looking at mini games or components within a game. So you can be doing iteration for the entire game and figuring out what mini games should go into it, or you might be doing iterations on an individual mini game to figure out what's the right way to approach that mini game. So you can break a project down into smaller parts, and then you can apply some of these same approaches and rules at different scopes. And one of the advantages of that is that you can also work on, if you like, you know, if you look at iterative development, there's a talk of the machine that makes the machine. You don't only have to revise what your process is for solving the problem. You also can look at your process for solving those problems, if that makes sense. So you can review, when you're taking a retrospective look at what went wrong, you can also ask yourself, did you fail early enough? Was there a way that you could have found that failure point when you have a problem and you find something that needs to fail? Could you have solved it sooner? And maybe that helps you revise your process for how you iterate quickly and how you find those problems quickly, and do a better job on the next mini game, for example, of finding those problems sooner. Okay, and yeah, so and if you look at those scopes as well, so by breaking things down using that self-similar approach as well, you can make the larger components less likely to have larger catastrophic failures, if you like, if you can solve those problems, the smaller scale problems first, and solve them in a simpler context. So you don't want to end up in a situation where you end up with basically something that's too big to fail. And you can no longer, if you end up in a situation where you have a project that's become too big to fail, you can no longer be agile, if that makes sense. So when we're talking about agile thinking, you want to get your problem solved while you can still make those changes. Okay, so that sort of talks about the motivation around iterative development. If we actually want to talk about, okay, what does iterative development actually look like, and what minimum viable product is a term you'll see used quite a lot of places. This is a concept of looking, and hopefully most of the people here are already familiar with this. If not, you should definitely be looking into it. The idea of a minimum viable product is basically talking about what is the smallest, what is the most basic, if you like, what are the fewest things we can put into our project or our product to make it viable for getting it to market. That's the idea behind a minimum viable product. When approaching this concept, I actually like to say it's really important to focus on that middle word, which is viable. If you look at this in terms of product development, it's common for part of viability is making something that actually can work and survive in a marketplace, assuming you're making it. So this is in terms of minimum viable product being a marketplace concept. This doesn't only apply to marketplaces. It has to be something that's actually got enough in it to work, but you also don't want to be adding extraneous features that you could be adding on if that product is successful once it's in the market. So one of the shifts that's happened in the games industry over the last few decades is a shift to the idea of DLC and adding content on for a game after it's shipped. One of the advantages of a concept like that is that allows a game to ship as a minimum viable product potentially, and then add more on for it later that could potentially add more revenue if that game is successful. We have the advantage in the modern age of being in a digital marketplace where updating things is absolutely a possibility. So this also means you can put a product out and find out if it's going to be successful, and then if it is, you can iterate on that and you can grow on and add to it. When I've been making computer games now for well over 20 years, and early in my career, game development meant making a gold master of a boxed product that would get printed onto a optical disc often and then sold in a store. One of the downsides to that was it was extremely hard to make a change once it was out there. So it did mean that you had to be far more precise about what something was. So now that we work in a digital marketplace for all software products, this is one of the reasons that that IT and internet companies and software development is able to work in such a rapid and evolving way, is that things can go out to the world and then can be updated after the fact. So you can work on what the minimum is and you can add features later. So you can think about focusing on the problems you need to solve for a minimum viable product. There's also the idea, if you look at iterative development, when you're trying to solve a problem of what gets called the maximum virtual product, which is if you don't yet have all your answers to know how to build your minimum virtual product, you can build a maximum virtual product, which is basically trying to simulate as much as you can of what the experience would be like to get some of those answers you need about how this should be done. So digital twins, or if you go into something like architecture or you go into manufacturing, something like that, are a thing that people like to use these days. They like to move into the virtual realm, into the computer realm, that we already have the benefit of working in, because you can do things more cheaply if, rather than building that factory, if you first build a virtual factory and you see, hey, let's have a look at a virtual digital twin of it and the way it works and see if we can figure out what some of the problems will be. Another approach that can be taken is cardboard planning. If you look at architecture, what's been a classic approach for years and years and years is actually building a physical model of a building to actually look at the shapes in the flesh and see what they're like, and see if you can solve the problems and see what works and doesn't work. That also can 100% apply to games. A really great way to make a really good rather than investing the time to actually start just diving in, as I say, headlong without a plan. If a game is a good concept, sometimes you can get a good idea of it by making a paper version of the game. Use post-it notes and chopped up bits of cardboard and draw simple pictures on them and figure out if you can, simulate your game mechanic on paper. That's a maximum virtual product. That's a great way to go, hey, will this work first? That's a way to so this is a way of finding a way to have a cheaper, quicker, easier way to test out your ideas before you then go through another cycle of simulation to work towards, and you're trying to answer questions there where it's cheap and quick and efficient. And if you find things that don't work with it, you can change them. You can answer questions about it before you move on to the more expensive process of actually writing the code and building the art and building out the project later on of building the full feature. And I might actually, if I can, just give me a moment while I... So a really great example of this is actually what gets called the Pixar method. And this is a classic iterative development approach. In the film industry, animatics and storyboarding are a really classic example of iterative development. And the Pixar approach to making films, Pixar are one of the most successful film companies of all time. Almost all of their films are successful, which is almost unheard of if you look at the film industry in general. And a lot of project management studies have actually gone into looking at Pixar and why they're so successful. And if we talk about trying to get sort of that idea of a simpler version to try and answer as many questions as you can early on, and animatic is a classic way to do that. I would encourage anyone who's interested in this to go and have a look. If you have a look at on YouTube, on Pixar's YouTube page, they have an entire playlist dedicated to side-by-sides where they show you animatics they've made alongside the final result of what actually ends up as a film. So what I might share, I'll just to choose one here. I think I saw one earlier. It's not bad. Here's one from the sequel to Finding Nemo. I think this is Finding Dory. So while we're watching this, I'll say, remember, don't just watch the film here. Pay attention to what's going on in that animatic up the top and how close it is to what goes on in the bottom shot. Okay. So hopefully you can see from that uh, how much simpler and how much cheaper it would have been to produce that animatic that you saw in the top frame than it would have been to produce a detailed digital version of the film you see in the bottom. So the way Pixar basically described that they work is they will storyboard it once they have. So after they've first got a script and they've worked a script, because obviously getting a story on the page first is much cheaper than just diving right in and starting to make your film straight away. They will start with storyboards, they will film it out, and they will make an animatic like that. And they will do basic voiceovers, they will do basic music. They'll get the shape of it. It doesn't look like much more than a comic book, does it? It's just a sketch. And then they'll play it in front of an audience of people, usually internally. And they will figure out, does it feel right? How does it respond? Do people enjoy this? Have they caught the audience? And they will learn from it. And this is the thing to recognize. They'll recognize when it takes too long to go through a certain sequence, or a scene isn't working and they need to cut it. And they'll make that change then. And they will go, and once they've got that, they'll go back and they'll make those changes. And they'll put it in front of an audience again, and again, and again, and again. And they'll do that apparently up to 8 times before they actually go into production on a film. You can imagine if they go through that process and they get to a fairly clear concept. If you have to cut an entire scene from a film, I don't know if people are that aware of what it costs to have all of the animation and modeling and rendering time that goes into making a scene. If you were to cut that scene late in the process after you'd done most of the development work, and that would end up on what might call the cutting room floor, that would cost a huge amount of money. If you have to cut it when all you've had is somebody basically draw some storyboards and then work through it, it's vastly cheaper. So basically that's failing fast. It's going through those iterations early to answer those questions. So this brings us to what I think, I talked really early on at the start about how part of agile thinking is actually a scientific approach. If you're going to approach this, the most important thing to work against your cognitive biases here is taking a methodical and scientific approach. All of that starts with the most important question for project planning, which is why. You always, always, always must ask why. And you have to ask, why are you building what you're building? What are you building it for? What is the goal? What are the risks and what are the challenges? And how are you going to answer those risks and challenges? And then what you want to do is you want to basically look at it and go, well, if we've got a risk and we think we've got a way of dealing with it, we need to figure out if we have solved that risk, or we've captured that audience, or or whatever your risk factor is for your project. You have to find those answers as quickly and as cheaply as possible. So if you can answer that question on paper, if you can answer that question with an animatic, if you can answer that question by building your game with boxes and spheres instead of building them with models, then you do that because it's cheaper. And you test it. And you don't just, and you, whenever you can, test it on other people who will, and you need to seek their feedback from them, and you need to be honest with yourself about that feedback. And you have to incorporate, but you have to recognize that this comes back to anchoring bias. You will want to think that the solution you already had is the right solution for that question, is the right answer to that question. So you have to take a really honest look and ask yourself, was that the right solution, or do I need to change? So to take another example, classic example of iterative development that's often put out there, SpaceX have been revolutionizing the space industry for well over a decade now. The traditional approach in the aerospace industry for years and years and years had been waterfall, giant mega projects that cost billions and billions of dollars. And often the way they would work would be they would build a gigantic rocket and it would cost billions of dollars, and they would have to put a lot of work into making sure it worked first time, which meant they had to spend more time and more effort on making it perfect, because if it didn't, it would cost billions of dollars if it blew up. SpaceX took a different approach. They went, well, we want to see if we can land this giant rocket. So instead of doing all of the work to build this giant rocket, they recognized that as a critical failure point. And if anyone, they built a thing called the Starhopper for the most recent. This is for the most recent iteration of the space of the Super Heavy, and they just built the simplest minimum viable product for something that could land, and they flew that just to test the idea. They would go and they would run hardware rich, because even though that might have been way more expensive than, I'm sure they did a lot of simulations first, way more expensive than doing the virtual version, it would have answered questions for them. It would have found problems that they might not have found otherwise, and then they could work those into the next iteration. So the reason they would have built what they built and not something else would be because they would have figured out what their risks were, and what questions they needed to answer, and they would have built the thing that answered those questions the soonest. And then they would have built another one to answer to the next question, and then the next question. And one of the differences that happens with an iterative development approach is each time you work on another iteration, you get better at doing those iterations. So part of it is also about, as I mentioned earlier, about refining your process. Each time you go through that iteration, you also review your process for iterating and as you go, hopefully you're getting better, so that by the time, so if you take the Pixar example of if they've built 8 animatics, by the time they get to build that final one, they should have got better at the process. And if you then take that self-similarity and then you go to the next film they make, they'll be better at how they answer those questions sooner, and what questions they need to get answers to sooner. Like how early do we need to bring in music? Can we get away without music for the first 3 iterations and then just add it in the 4th? Or do we need to have music in the first one? They'll get better at making those decisions as they iterate. So they're learning. So learning is the key thing that comes out of a process like this. So you need to have a clear idea of, and now one of the things about a scientific approach is you make a thesis, you have a theory, and then you go out and you test it. So you build something to test that theory, and then you need to go back and you need to assess against those criteria you set. So in most of these different cases we're talking about, that's what's called a green light process. It's really important to have a green light process where you actually go back, and this is where you want to be taking those questions you set ahead of time and asking yourself, did we really hit it? And trying to come up with methodical approaches or objective feedback. So if you can do questionnaires, for example, if you're putting it in front of people, that's a way of trying to get objective feedback, and assessing that is really important. In writing, even though the idea of agile thinking and fail fast is a fairly modern concept, the advice in writing, I think, from from the Life of Samuel Johnson, which is a book written in the 1700s. So I come from a theatre background very long ago. When I was taught to be a writer, this is one of the quotes that was given to me, which is, read over your compositions, and wherever you meet with a passage which you think is particularly fine, strike it out. It's that it's that idea of working against your cognitive biases that in later years, coming into the 20th century, that there's I believe a film that's only happened in the last few years called Kill Your Darlings, which is a reference to a quote that was basically a revision of that concept that happened in the 20th century, which is that idea of your ideas, particularly when they're creative and you've invested in them personally, you've invested effort into them, you're going to love them, and killing your darlings is hard. You're going to love, it is really hard to acknowledge with yourself sometimes when, what you thought was going to be that answer isn't what it was, and you need to let go of it. It needs to be that handful of rice in the monkey trap. Sometimes you need to let go of that handful of rice because there's something better just around the corner. And by working through a methodical process, you put yourself in a better situation to get out of the monkey trap, to kill your darlings, to strike out that particularly fine passage, because you will stop losing what's called the opportunity cost. You'll stop investing time and effort into something that was never going to work, and you'll provide yourself space and opportunity to move on to better things, basically. You're going to fail those ideas faster. Okay, and look, one last piece of advice I will give about getting that as well is, one thing I've often found is that it's really hard when you try and assess something to say, is like, for example, if you're trying to build a game or a mini game to go into a game, you say, is this a good mini game? Yes or no? You've already invested time and effort into building that mini game. If instead you build 5 mini games and you ask yourself, which 3 are the best? I've found that people often do much better with that. Because when you can look at two things side by side and say, well, is this one better than that one? That's much easier than saying, is this good enough? Because good enough is a really difficult concept. So this is the kind of thing where I talk about asking yourself if, well, what we need is we need the 3 best mini games for whatever it is, for the particular solution we're trying to get to, the particular concept we're trying to get forward in our game. That's the idea of finding a methodical approach where you're going to be prepared to, if 2 things have to go on the chopping block and you just have to choose which, that's easier than just going, should I put this on the chopping block or not? So this is about finding processes and finding ways for yourself to make those decisions methodical and make them easier. And so look, I think we're probably at about time there. And the last thing I'll say is context matters too. When you're making these decisions, I think I talked really early on about anchoring bias and conservatism bias, which is that humans as a tendency, we don't want to integrate new information. So when new information comes in, when the context changes, so do your requirements. And you might have to adjust your requirements as well, or you might have to adjust your solutions based on that new information. This is the learning part of failing fast and making it learn fast. When there's new information, you must incorporate that into your approach. And that can be your approach on how to solve the problem, but it can also be about whether your approach to approaching solutions, if you like. So the machine that makes the machine is the right one. Rightio. Well, look, at that point, I think we're probably at a good point there to maybe say, do we want to move to questions? Because we're pretty close to time.
We are, but first of all, thank you very much, Matt. That was really, really great. Some fantastic insights there. I love this whole idea of that you still need a plan, right? Like you just stumble into something and then sort of, wing it. But you need a plan to begin with. And, I think that's something that's often overlooked. So thank you very much for those fantastic insights. Really appreciate it. So as Matt was saying, now there's an opportunity for you to ask some questions. So please ask away. And I'll do that. By the way, I really like this story or this metaphor of the monkey grabbing onto the rice. Also reminds me of the Simpsons episode where Homer is grabbing onto the soda can.
Yes, I'm sure that's a direct cultural reference that they were using in that one. Actually, maybe I should have used that one. People would have known it better.
Well, apparently younger people don't get Simpsons references anymore, even though the 90s were just 10 years ago. I don't.
I know, because I would have been right on that one. Yeah, I'm just immediately, I'm like, yeah, that classic line, Mr. Simpson, are you still holding onto the can? I think that says everything about fail fast and learn fast right there. Sometimes you've got to let go of the can.
Yeah, that's right. Kill your darlings. Let go of the can. All right. Do any of you have any questions? Otherwise, Matt and I may just engage in more obscure Simpsons references.
I will say I'm used to speaking inside in front of an audience. The lesson for me going into this, actually, just talking to a webcam is you get less audience feedback.
Yeah, no, fair enough. No, you've done a great job. Lemma is asking, can you recommend any frameworks for creating game prototypes using physical items such as cardboard demos?
That is a fantastic question. I will actually say I'm probably not the best one to answer that one. So I can't recommend any frameworks, but that is actually if you can manage to maybe round up any experienced game developers, that would be a great question to ask. Sorry, great game designers. Sorry, not game developers. Beg your pardon. That's the kind of thing where when I look at people who are designers for a living, I'm not a designer for a living, and their approaches to this. I have seen, for example, within my own studio, though, people use paper prototypes already. They will cut out the pieces. They will. Oh, sorry. People want the room. Beg your pardon. They'll that they'll yeah, board games are a classic paper prototype. See if you can come up with a board game version of your idea. That's because if you like, that refers back to a way of approaching games that's been around for much longer than computer games. So I'd say start with a board game if you can. If your idea can work as a board game, I'm sure you can make it work as a computer game.
Yeah, very good call, and that is certainly one of the standard approaches to game design. So, you'll find that advice in books on game design as well. That Jesse Shell, for example, talks about that in his book of lenses. So, check that out as well. Do we have any more questions? If that's not the case, please join me in thanking Matt for so generously donating his time today. We'll be back tomorrow. And tomorrow you can join us for a talk on problem solving and initiative with a focus on game design presented by Miles Blessonato from Blowfish. Gemma, maybe you can keep that question in the back of your mind. Maybe you can make it tomorrow because Miles is highly experienced when it comes to game design and he may have some further advice. But until then, thank you, Matt. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for taking your time. And hopefully I'll see you all back tomorrow.